It's Game Boy World, and this is a middling attempt at arcade classic Paperboy. I swear one of these days we'll come across a good Western-developed Game Boy game, but today is not that day. Not that there's anything wrong with the underlying game itself here. Paperboy was an 80s arcade classic, a creative and whimsical take on what we think of today as the infinite runner genre. After making a splash in the arcades, it made its way to a seemingly endless array of home consoles and computers at the end of the 80s and into the early 90s. Some of these renditions turned out better than others. Game Boy's Paperboy adaptation is one of the lesser ports, whereas the NES version is fondly regarded and a lot of fun. Here's the rub though, they're the same game. Yes, once again we've run afoul of the unfortunate tendency for developers to take an NES release and move it over to Game Boy by simply cropping its screen dimensions and stripping out its color. This never turns out well, but it feels particularly egregious in Paperboy thanks to the game's unconventional design and mechanics, which are poorly served by the snip it, strip it, and ship it approach to the presentation. Paperboy belongs to that little corner of 80s arcade games whose designers attempted to work around the inherently two-dimensional nature of bitmap graphics by presenting everything through a forced isometric perspective. Think Crystal Castles, Return of the Jedi, or PAC-MANIA. Paperboy works along the same lines. You control the eponymous Paperboy as he rides along a neighborhood street, attempting to make deliveries to subscribers along the way. Instead of cruising down a road whose orientation lies along a vertical or horizontal axis relative to the screen, though, you're pedaling at a 45-degree angle, upward and to the right. As a kid on a bike, the Paperboy constantly pedals forward, so the screen constantly scrolls at a 45-degree angle, though you can adjust the speed at which you travel. Otherwise, though, you simply need to steer to avoid obstacles while attempting to deliver papers as accurately as possible. The Paperboy carries a limited number of newspapers, which basically work like projectiles. You throw them to deliver them, and you earn extra points for accuracy if you can hit a subscriber's mailbox. Papers also possess defensive and offensive functions, as you can toss them to stun hazards that appear along the way. That includes dogs, runaway lawnmowers, and even the Grim Reaper. It's a rough neighborhood. While you cycle at a 45-degree angle, you toss papers along an essentially horizontal path, which makes aiming much simpler than if the entire perspective of the game operated along the same isometric grid. I say essentially horizontal because there is just a hint of forward momentum to your papers. They travel forward very slightly rather than flying along a pure horizontal axis, so you need to account for the deviance in your throws for maximum accuracy. If you want to be completely reductive about it, Paperboy amounts to a slanted version of IREM's Moon Patrol. You move forward constantly, avoid hazards along your path, and fire projectiles more or less perpendicular to your route. It's more than just slanted moon patrol, though. The isometric perspective adds a high degree of challenge to the action, and the unique theme of the game, which raises a mundane activity like delivering newspapers into high-stakes drama, gives it a personality all its own. In the arcade, Paperboy even carried this theme through to the cabinet on which was mounted a distinctive handlebar controller for added verisimilitude. Of course, the home versions couldn't offer that, but the underlying game design still shone through, and the best-selling NES version remains a favorite among many gamers. You never really hear people moon over the Game Boy version, though, and that's because it's kind of a disaster. It reproduces the NES version faithfully, perfectly reducing the console game's full-color graphics into simple monochrome, and in doing so, it renders the game nearly unplayable. Paperboy was always going to be at a bit of a disadvantage in black and white to begin with. Color factors into the gameplay pretty heavily. There's always a lot happening on screen at any given moment in a session of Paperboy, and color provides an important visual clue for gamers. So your paper deliveries must only be made to paying subscribers. If you miss a subscriber's porch or mailbox, or if you break one of their windows by accident, you'll lose that customer. The game gives you a quick indication of which houses along the block should be delivered to at the beginning of a round, but as with all the particulars in any given session of Paperboy, these are determined at random. Unless you have a good memory, you'll need visual clues along the way to help you figure out which homes need papers. In every version but Game Boy, that visual cue takes the form of color. Subscribers live in blue or yellow houses, while non-customers live in red. On Game Boy, though, they all live in gray homes. Subscriber homes tend to be a lighter gray than non-subscribers, but really the only sure sign you have for a mandatory delivery is the presence of a mailbox in front of that home. The use of dark and light shades to denote the nature of a house might not be completely useless, but for the fact that Game Boy's Paperboy port crops the screen so severely. Due to the loss of more than half the NES game's pixel information, you can barely even see the houses as they scroll by diagonally at the upper left corner of the screen. This is only the beginning of Paperboy's resolution woes, though. The in-close camera perspective doesn't only take a chunk out of the upper left edges of the screen, where the houses scroll past, it also zooms in close to the Paperboy himself. Paperboy's isometric perspective has the somewhat strange result of effectively limiting the player's movement to the bottom right quarter of the screen. The upper half of the screen shows what's coming ahead, and the bottom left quarter works as a sort of target zone for your newspapers, from which occasional threats can also emerge. The Game Boy port basically gives you about a third of the space to maneuver as in the console or arcade versions. This makes the game massively more difficult because you literally do not have time or space to react to most hazards. The obstacles that appear in each stage of Paperboy are placed randomly at the beginning of each round, so you have to dodge obstacles or threat as they appear rather than through memorization. On Game Boy, basically any element that appears randomly in the street shows up a split second before you collide with it, essentially meaning you have to avoid biking in the streets altogether. So, in addition to lacking color cues to alert you to the different kinds of homes you're pedaling past at a glance, Paperboy on Game Boy also hampers playability by destroying your mobility and giving you insufficient time to respond to its random hazards. So, despite being almost exactly the same game as the NES version, this portable adaptation is vastly more difficult and considerably less fun than the source version. It's not that Paperboy couldn't work on a portable system, the Lynx version turned out to be pretty darn good. The existence of that version, incidentally, makes Paperboy a somewhat remarkable Game Boy release. Here's a game by Atari, released more or less simultaneously on both Nintendo's Game Boy and Atari's own Lynx. The Game Boy release wasn't necessarily Atari voting no confidence on their own platform, of course. Remember that at this point, Atari existed as two separate and autonomous entities, Atari Corporation and Atari Games. Atari Games actually made Paperboy, while Atari Corp handled hardware, like the Lynx. Though the two companies tended to work closely together, with a huge number of Atari Games arcade creations coming to Lynx, it's not like they were dating exclusively or anything. We'll get to the Lynx version of Paperboy in due time, but whether by design or by happenstance, it's safe to say that Atari Games saved the best portable rendition of Paperboy for Atari Corp's console. Paperboy on Lynx demonstrates the game could work within the restrictions of a portable console, provided it was properly redesigned. Game Boy's Paperboy, however, was not properly redesigned, and it renders a classic arcade game into something that's, well, if not quite unplayable, certainly not much fun to play. It's hard to get solid info on the forces behind this version of the game. It was published by MINDSCAPE, a company that handled quite a few Atari conversions for Nintendo systems once Tengen went rogue. But the developer appears to have been a company called Eastridge Technology. The Eastridge technology behind Paperboy doesn't seem to exist anymore. The current holder of the name is a North Carolina-based software company founded in 1998, so it's pretty safe to say they weren't working on any games in 1990. I did find some speculation online that the older Eastridge was in fact a company that consisted of a single man, which might make it sort of the American equivalent of Micronix. Though I do have to say that the NES adaptation of Paperboy turned out a whole lot better than anything Micronix ever developed. Whatever the story behind this rendition of Paperboy, it ultimately ranks as a good game that ran afoul of a design trap we've seen time and time again on Game Boy, sticking too close to a console predecessor. While it doesn't make for a particularly enjoyable game experience, you can at least forgive MINDSCAPE and Eastridge Technology, or whoever, for making a common error their first time out of the Game Boy gates. The question is, did they get things back on track with subsequent releases? I'm not optimistic, but we'll see in due time, I suppose. In the meantime, this is definitely not the version of Paperboy to play. Stick with the NES or Lynx adaptations. Next time on Game Boy World, The Ballad of Bimmy Lee.